encouraging and certainly very relevant to, of course, the celebration of Easter that took place yesterday. Now, a little bit later this hour, I'm going to get to a very good article we've posted on our website. You can go kind of read ahead if you'd like. This one comes from our friend John Fund. Used to be, of course, with Wall Street Journal, now with National Review. In some places, Easter isn't being celebrated, it's being fined. And that relates to some of the material that we will talk about today, but we will talk about in some detail on Friday because Kelly Shackelford will be with us, because some of the examples that John Fund uses actually relate to something that he actually had to go to court over. The King James Bible Baptist Church was in trouble in Mississippi, of all places, simply because they held a drive-in services. Something, by the way, I'm familiar with. Some of my Sunday school members joined me and have joined me the last 2 weeks in the parking lot of Prestonwood Baptist Church. Every car is spaced out. Everybody can see each other. You can, of course, pull up on the laptop so you can see the keynote material on your laptop or your iPad if you have it. But we also just broadcast on a low-frequency FM. And shouldn't be any problem at all, but apparently it is a problem in some states. So Kelly Shackelford was able to get an injunction against that. There is a hearing that takes place tomorrow on that injunction, and we'll probably talk more about some of those stories later as well. Also, we'll get into the back and forth between Donald Trump and Anthony Fauci, and I'll certainly cover that as well because it's kind of in the news. I think it's a tempest in the teapot, but you just never know. If indeed the president decides to fire him, which I really see unlikely, then we have a lot to talk about. But we always do anyway. So those arguments are certainly on the table, and we'll take those on as well. If you would like to know what's going to be happening during the National Hour, which starts at 1 o'clock, we'll have Michael Youssef with us, founder and president of Leading the Way, and we'll be talking about faith in the time of crisis. Also, I thought I'd mention just a little bit of his newest book, which also relates to the whole future of Christianity, saving Christianity. We'll talk about what he means by the need to save Christianity. We'll get into some of that with him. Then we'll get back into some of these issues we've been discussing in terms of the coronavirus and the pandemic and all the rest, and maybe in some cases the overreaction, somewhat in this country, but definitely in other countries. If there's anything that has saved us, it is, first of all, I think this president understands federalism, generally, at least, and also recognize there are only certain things that the president can do, and the rest of it's in the hands of the states. And so between federalism and also maybe a dedication to limited government, the kind of abuses that we're seeing in, as you might expect, former communist countries, but even in modern democracies in Europe, pretty amazing. So we'll go into that a little bit later. And we'll be talking with Tom Catena in the second hour of that national broadcast, as we'll talk about Africa's forgotten war victims. And if you think problems are difficult for us in this country, where people do have food, clothing, and shelter, just imagine what is happening in other countries. There was a very good piece that came out from our friends at World Vision. Matter of fact, it was really well done because you had everything from Michael W. Smith playing music from his home. You had Max Lucado giving a message from his home. You had a variety of other individuals that were part of that teaching, but they also had the World Vision people speaking to this coronavirus, and this has made it even worse for the extremely poor in the world. So we'll be talking about that as well. But if you go to the website, your first article here is by George Gilder. He's been on the program with us, been a member of years since then. But I love what he says. We need politicians in a pandemic. He says, of course, the U.S. economy has been cratered. He says less by the coronavirus than by the response to it, driven by what he says the undemocratic idea that science should rule, even when much of the science and data behind it remain in dispute. I was going to go into that, but I think we sort of covered that pretty well, that in some respects, some of these models have not turned out so well. And so when people say, well, you've got to trust the science, well, I trust the medical science. I don't trust the models. And I think there is a difference, as you might see. Nevertheless, on the next page, he says, since many liken fighting the coronavirus to a war, Although we pointed out how in war you sometimes give your life for your way of life. In this case, we're giving up our way of life to save your life. But nevertheless, he says we should remember that even in war, admirals and generals defer to civilian authority, to the president as commander-in-chief on matters of strategy, and to Congress on matters of budget. So we don't let generals make every decision about a war. By implication, we shouldn't let doctors make every decision about a pandemic. And he says the demands of healthcare experts are not greater than the demands of the economy for a very simple reason. He says the healthcare system is not separate from the economy, but a crucial part of it. The healthcare system saves lives. The economy provides everything we need. The damage being done to the economy, he says, if sustained, could easily cost more lives worldwide than the coronavirus. And so he acknowledges that Anthony Fauci is a fine physician, but he's not in the position to cure what ails us. We're beset by more than a virus. We're beset, as he says, by bad ideas about what government can and should do and about who should be making those decisions. So he's calling for some kind of common sense, and I think makes a very good case for the fact that as important as it is to keep people safe, it's also important to begin to think about, as my commentaries this week are really starting to articulate, what does it look like when we eventually move away from a lockdown, and who should make those decisions? Anyway, let's take a break. My commentary is coming up. For those of you listening online, you can hear my comments, but we have a lot more to cover right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The country has effectively been in lockdown for weeks, but many are asking, when will all of this change? President Trump optimistically hoped Americans could be in church on Easter. Yesterday was a reminder that we aren't even close to bringing normalcy to our society. We need to start talking about an end game, or to use a military term, we need an exit strategy. Epidemiologists and infectious disease specialists rightly focus on the medical health of humans, but economists and politicians need to focus on the economic and social health of a country that has been shut down. One of the best ideas I've seen came from New York Times column by Thomas Friedman, who writes about a plan to get America back to work. He quotes Dr. David Katz, a public health expert at Yale University. He proposes a targeted approach in which we reboot the economy while also calling for the most vulnerable to shield themselves from infection. He also calls for establishing mobile testing and temperature check systems like Korea. Ronald Klein, who served as President Obama's Ebola response coordinator, writes that it is time to reopen production facilities, even if it has to be done with fewer workers per shift, who are spread further apart. We could even allow some stores to open with limited capacity and hours. You know, these are good ideas that the president and the governors should consider, especially since all of these ideas come from people who certainly are not fans of Donald Trump. But this is an election year. The moment the president or governors mention these ideas, they will face a firestorm of criticism. We need an endgame, but there will be a political price to pay for implementing it. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View. your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to find some of the articles we're quoting from today, you can find those on the website, pointofview.net. As you go there, you might also click on that button that says donate, because we are dependent upon your financial support to continue this ministry. But the second article I have entitled American Response to the Virus. It comes from the editors of the Washington Free Beacon, and will start out negative, but then end up being positive, because the editors are making a case for the fact that we in the past as a country have risen to the occasion more than once. He uses, for example, the editors use the example of World War II, and then talks about this as well. But the editors start out by reminding us that because we are sort of all stuck in our homes, and because there isn't as much to write about, because the news really has kind of focused almost exclusively on the coronavirus, we're seeing more and more people doing what these editors call America bashing. Let me just read a couple of examples. After a while, it just kind of makes your head hurt, but I'll read one paragraph and you get the idea. Rachel Maddow eagerly tracks America's lead-in infections. The Center for American Progress accepts the claims of dictatorships in order to diss the president. When the United States acknowledged more COVID-19 cases than any other country, Hillary Clinton remarked with barely restrained glee, "He did promise America first," or as one journalist put it, "Who's the blank country now?" You get the idea. He goes through this entire list of some of the comments that were actually made about that. So then a little bit later, they said, look, to be fair, the Trump administration was slow to respond. We understand that. Bureaucratic sclerosis at the Food and Drug Administration, at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention set testing back by weeks, and the president's early statements downplaying the disease were irresponsible at best. So they acknowledge all that, and then they talk about some of the charts and all that. But then they also say, but let's put some common sense or some perspective here. Forget that the United States is about the same size as Europe, meaning that country-scale comparisons are meaningless. Forget also that China and Iran are almost certainly lying about their tallies, lies the media often repeat unquestionably. And so they then go into the fact that, nevertheless, whenever there's been a challenge for this country, we see that the American people dedicate themselves to making a difference. Companies, businesses, corporations make a difference. And they point out that on the eve of World War II, the United States was ill prepared. I did not know this, with an army smaller than Portugal's. Then we were, of course, slow to respond after Pearl Harbor, though. Of course, you remember the famous quote, which may or may not be completely accurate, but from Yamamoto, the admiral, "I fear we have done to awaken the sleeping giant and fill him with terrible resolve." And the editors say he was right. 12 million men enlisted. Factories churned out 300,000 aircraft. And in a few short years, America built the mightiest military in the history of the world. And so they now turn from, okay, what happened in World War II? What's happening right now? And this is the good news that I, quite frankly, don't see you getting reported very often. It said, we once built planes. Now we make tests. In just a month, America's gone from a few thousand tested to over 2.2 million. By the way, I'm going to give you that number in just a minute. We're on pace to do 1 million more every week. Germany is testing about a third as many people. South Korea, 10 times fewer. The United States is larger, so has further to go, but the growth of its testing regime is breathtaking. So first of all, we're doing more testing. What about producing those vaccines? As best I can determine from what we have here, we have about, again, there are all sorts of things. There are the various antiviral treatments, remdesivir, for example. And, of course, we've talked about a number of others. Right now, probably 78 different vaccines are being considered, developed, in some cases tested. And guess what? Half of those were made right here in the United States by North American laboratories. And when a vaccine comes, America will be ready to churn it out. And let's give credit where credit is due, because they point out that Bill Gates and his 7 vaccine factories are where a lot of that's taking place. Bill Gates, okay? So if nothing else, the point they're making here is, sometimes we have to recognize that, sure, the United States has flaws. And sure, right now, if you look at the sick map put out by the Johns Hopkins University, we're at the top of the list for the most number of deaths. Now, whether that's accurate based upon whether we really know the actual deaths in Iran and especially China, but okay, that's where we are. And certainly the administration has been slow to respond, because we're going to get into that in just a minute, because of some of the comments made by Anthony Fauci, Dr. Fauci. But nevertheless, what they end their editorial, which you can read in its entirety, by saying some would prefer to say that the coronavirus crisis has shown America at its worst. We should be more like China, they argue, welding sick people into their own homes. Of course, there's a little facetiousness there, obviously. Despite the long road ahead, however, we think the coronavirus reveals America at its best, bloody but unbowed, facing this fearsome new enemy with overwhelming might. And if you want to give credit, let's give credit to Bill Gates. But, we might also give some credit instead of criticism to people like Mike Lindell, who said, you know what, My Pillow will actually turn over 3/4 of our factory to produce masks rather than pillows. And, of course, he was criticized for it as well. So if nothing else, it gets back to, some of those numbers I mentioned just a minute ago. And that struck me over the weekend. Maybe I'm the only one that noticed it. And that is when you go to what's called the sick map. You can go to it by typing in sick map. You can go to it by typing in Johns Hopkins map. You can go to it by going to the Drudge report. There are just a lot of different ways you can get to it. I noticed something very interesting, because if you go to the map, matter of fact, I might as well just see if I can open it up right now while we're talking, you will notice something is missing. The number of people that have actually recovered. You have on the left-hand side, of course, the list of all the people that have been confirmed. You have on the right-hand side the total number of deaths. And then you also have a chart on the total tested in the United States. But that's all you see. And unless you scroll down, you don't see anything else. As a matter of fact, even right now, I'm having trouble scrolling down and finding it. But there it is. The total recovered is no longer on the screen. Now, I thought, did they just take it out? Has there been a controversy about that? Why is that not on the screen? Well, it could just simply be because we just didn't have enough room, and we thought it was more important to talk about the number of people being tested. So we just hid it behind the one on the total number of deaths. So you have to actually find where to click it and find that there, when I first did it this morning, it was 441,000. Now it's 443,000 individuals that have been recovered, but you no longer see it on the screen, which I think is kind of interesting. Now, it could be nothing more than just needing to move some things around, or it could be that maybe this has become politicized, and that leads me to this piece that I'll read just before we take a break that comes from the editors of the Wall Street Journal, because they said that if the world is going to break out of its miserable choice between economic lockdowns and the rages of the coronavirus, the best bet is science. A better understanding of the bug and its biology will pave the way for treatments, vaccines, and more efficient mitigation methods. So it's not a good sign, they say, when the West's preeminent Journal of Natural Science appears to be indulging in political obsessions and language control at the expense of critical discovery. And that would be Nature magazine. If you have taken any classes in science, you've read both Science magazine and Nature magazine, which this week published an editorial in which it lambasted those who erroneously have been associating the virus with Wuhan and China, which, by the way, is where it came from. It even chastised President Trump, of course, but also politicians in the UK, saying that China bears the responsibility. But as we've documented on this program, of course it does. And yet, interestingly enough, completely ignores the fact that even the fact that we call this disease COVID-19 probably isn't accurate, because the virus itself is called SARS-2, but there was really a political attempt I think coming from the World Health Organization, not to call it SARS, because most people remember that SARS actually originated in China in 2000. So there's been an attempt by the World Health Organization, by a number of politically correct people, and now, sadly, even by the editors of Nature magazine, to politicize the coronavirus science. That's something that needs to change, but if nothing else, illustrates the world that we find ourselves in right now. Let's take a break. We have a lot more to cover right after this.
2020. Is there anything important happening this year? Well, not unless you consider major disputes in various Christian denominations, international tensions over a flu epidemic, economic uncertainties, and a presidential election important. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It's easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You're listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. As I mentioned before, as a program note, in about half an hour, we'll have Michael Youssef with us, and we'll be talking about certainly how to find faith in a time of crisis, what he's been doing at his own church there as well, the Church of the Apostles in Atlanta, Georgia. We'll talk a little bit about his book, Saving Christianity, and then we'll get back into some of these issues related to the pandemic. But just a few minutes ago, I talked about some of the kind of politically correct ideas that are coming out there, and that actually has been used against the Surgeon General. The Surgeon General is African American. His name is Jerome Adams. Seems like an outstanding individual. We've never done a chance to interview him before, but if you have been paying attention at all to Twitter, and I'd recommend that maybe you avoid it, but nevertheless, or even seen some of the news stories, he has now been criticized for something that actually he's been saying for a while. You almost wonder if there's like a memo that goes out to say, now it's time to criticize anybody associated with Donald Trump. And so we'll go after Anthony Fauci, which I'll get to in just a minute. We'll go after, I don't know, maybe Deborah Birx, and we'll go after the Surgeon General, Jerome Adams, because on more than one occasion, he's used the phraseology about that whatever you do, if you're a young person, do this, even if you are going to maybe not get the virus or not suffer complications, do it for, and he'd oftentimes say, for Pop or Big Mama, something like that. Those are phrases he's used for at least a week. Now, to be honest with you, the first time I heard him use them, I thought, okay, that doesn't sound real professional. And having spent a fair amount of time on college campuses before I did this talk show, I oftentimes would go out of my way to make sure I didn't say anything that could be misconstrued or used against me just because of the phraseology. I would always try to use inclusive language. So it sort of took that argument away from feminist. I would try to oftentimes describe individuals, African American or people of color, whatever you would want as how you would be described. I would use the politically correct language because I didn't want that to distract from the message I was getting out. And I thought, he was being a little bit too colloquial when he was talking about do it for your big mama or for your granddad or for your pop. Well, he finally caught it. And I think, again, this was an outrage from African Americans, part of the black community, because he said, whatever you do, do it for your abuela, which was an attempt to try to reach out to the Hispanic American population, Big Mama, Pop, and a number of others. And then, of course, he even caught criticism because he was telling those individuals, the people that would be Hispanic American, African American, to not drink, smoke, or in any way use drugs and to follow the government's guidelines. So, of course, what happened instantaneously is people saying, first of all, why did you use those phrases? Those are offensive. Now, they couldn't say it's racist because he's black. I guess they could call him racist, but that's something. And so they didn't like the fact that he was pandering to them. He was using offensive language. And especially telling those specific communities to stop drinking and smoking during this pandemic. Well, there's a reason he used that, in case you haven't heard by now, and that is African Americans and Hispanic Americans, but I'll just focus on African Americans, are dying at a disproportionate rate. Chicago, for example, represents the African American population in Chicago, 32%. The number that have died, 67%. Milwaukee County, 26%. The number died, 73%. How about just the state of Louisiana? 32% are African American, 70% of the deaths are African American. Michigan, which we'll talk about a little bit later when we get into what the governor is doing in Michigan, only about 14% of the entire state of Michigan is African American. Most of it, of course, located in some of the centers like Detroit, Dearborn, places like that. But 41% of the deaths in Michigan, African American. So this was an attempt, obviously, to have somebody who is African American speak to the African American community and say, at the very least, don't be cavalier about these guidelines, but instead of wanting to repeat that and encourage people in those communities to be more responsible. Of course, they've attacked the messenger, Jerome Adams. Now, let's give him some credit. The coverage that he should have been receiving today and over the weekend, but especially today, since he said this morning, is that now he has also pointed out that these models that we've talked about before, which were being used, are now using real data from the United States instead of these predictive models, which I think had erroneous data. He said previously the task force was working with what are called predictive models, many times, if nothing else, pulling information from different cultures and places around the world. Now, because we're into this a lot further, the models that they have been using really are based on actual data from places like California and New York. And so in some respects, that provides maybe a little bit more of an accurate prediction. And that's what the mainstream press should have covered today, but that's not what the mainstream press covered. Over the weekend, of course, let's get to the one that sort of the elephant in the room. And that is, over the weekend, there have been some interviews with Dr. Anthony Fauci, in which being pressed by the individuals in the media finally acknowledged, especially on CNN, that, yes, if we could have done this earlier, we would have been better off. His quote was, it's very difficult to go back and say that if we could have actually implemented social distancing earlier. He says, obviously, you could logically say that if you had had a process that was ongoing and you started mitigation earlier, you could have saved lives. No one's going to deny that. But what goes into those kind of decisions is complicated, you think? Because we remember the reaction to this. But, of course, never to let a comment go. Of course, the president's tweet went out of his way to explain the fact that this, he believes, was just a good example, again, of fake news. And he actually reminded people, well, first of all, let's give you the tweet, of the idea that he tweeted that if anything, this was fake news, because if you remember right, he says, you even had Deanna Lorraine, a former House candidate in California's 12th congressional district, who actually tweeted #Fire Fauci. And, of course, Fauci is, of course, now the kind of the lead story. Is Donald Trump going to actually fire Anthony Fauci? But it, again, is based on this assumption that if we could have implemented all of this earlier, we wouldn't have had this problem. So I put together kind of a hypothetical timeline. January 17th. Donald Trump halts flights from China. Of course, this would be a couple of weeks earlier. Sunday, January 19th, Democrats go on the talk shows and say that he has done this to distract from impeachment. Monday, January 20th, President Trump halts flights now from most of Europe. Tuesday, January 21st, all Democratic senators say they will now vote to remove Donald Trump. Wednesday, January 22nd, the president now calls for a lockdown of the U.S. Thursday, January 23rd, business leaders meet with him, come out of the meeting, say they are very disturbed to hear that he may actually shut down most of the economy. Friday, January 24th, Mike Pence is actually tapped to head up the coronavirus task force. On Sunday, January 26th, Democrats on talk shows now say this shows the authoritarian actions of Donald Trump. Oh, by the way, during that same time, Anthony Fauci says this is not a major threat. He actually did, by the way, say that on January 21st. This is not a major threat, not something that citizens of the United States should be worried about. Monday, January 27th, Nancy Pelosi announced that the House not only now having investigated Donald Trump will now investigate Mike Pence. Wednesday, January 29th, the Evangelical Advisory Board meets with the president to pray for him, but then after the meeting come out and say in front of the microphones that many of them have decided to step down from the Evangelical Advisory Board because the president said he was closing down church services by Easter. February 4th, State of the Union address. The president gives a State of the Union address, is booed continuously, and at the end announces that he would leave office. And Wednesday, February 5th, the House dedicates its investigation now to Mike Pence, who has become the president of the United States. Of course, that's just very hypothetical, but you can see exactly what would have happened if the president on, say, January 17th, instead of January 26th, had even started this process. This would have been taking place during the impeachment and would have been justification for perhaps him even leaving office, because don't you think maybe even at that point, Mitt Romney might have been able to convince a number of other Republicans to vote for the president to be removed from office while the impeachment hearings were taking place. It's something to think about, but nevertheless, you can see what might have happened if the president indeed had called for some of these actions, which now we take for granted. Anyway, let's take a break. We'll talk about what happened in churches tomorrow, right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. What happened in churches yesterday? Perhaps nothing, because you were actually at home watching your church service, but there have been a few individuals that have said, why can't we just at least go to the parking lot and listen to the sermon and wave from our cars and those kinds of things? But that apparently has been controversial. So our fourth article comes from Red State, written by Nick Arema, pointing out that the governor of Kentucky has actually issued an order against public gatherings. And actually, the governor had threatened to record license plate numbers and then order a 14-day quarantine for anybody that actually was in attendance. But that still didn't stop some of the people at Maryville Baptist Church And the parishioners got a real surprise because when they showed up, first of all, there were nails on the entrance to the parking lot of the church. And then what they also found is that the police were then recording the license plate numbers of anybody in the parking lot, including the license plate numbers of the reporters who were covering the story. This is something I thought was kind of rich. Wouldn't it be something if the governor then ordered those people that were reporters to actually be in a mandatory 14-day quarantine? And so this article is the fourth article. You can read it in its entirety, and it just goes into that in some detail. And I thought I'd pick up another one, which is our fifth article, and this one comes from a friend, John Fund, who, like I said, used to be with the Wall Street Journal, now is writing with National Review. And he talks about a couple of these stories, some of which actually are connected to Kelly Shackelford, who's been defending the pastor there of the church in Greenville, Mississippi. The Wednesday night, the church held a drive-in service using a low-frequency radio station signal, and we have done that even at our own church for my Sunday school class, so that you can just go down on your dial and hear it. But nevertheless, the attendees were surrounded by police cars ordering them to leave, and the police officer is recorded on video saying, "Your rights are suspended." Well, that was too much for Kelly Shackelford, so he was able to get an injunction. I'll talk more about that in just a minute, and they'll have hearings on that on Tuesday. But at another church, at Greenville's Temple Baptist Church, police started coming up and said these people were saying, "We think we're within their rights," but they started issuing tickets, $500 tickets. And there have made, the best estimate may have been 20 or 30 of these $500 tickets, so we'll see where that one takes us. Let's move over to the state of Virginia for just a minute. Lighthouse Fellowship was upset. In this particular case, many of these others, of course, in the parking lot, which seems fair and safe and all of the rest. But here, this was a group that was holding a church service for 16 people who were spaced out in a sanctuary that seats 293. But again, that controversy surfaced there as well. And so on a couple of occasions, Saturday night, I did see that posted on the website by First Liberty. The district court judge issued a temporary restraining order against the mayor's order. And you have two different organizations right now, the Alliance Defending Freedom and First Liberty Institute, which are filing some lawsuits on behalf of some of these churches. Kelly Shackelford, who will be with us on Friday, in this particular quote said there is a problem with some of these orders because the orders target churches in a way that it targets no other group. Cars in parking lots are fine. It's only a crime if the cars in the parking lot are in the church parking lot, he points out. So we'll see where some of these take us. And again, I think it has been encouraging to see that most churches have been willing to comply with that. And those which actually violate the order, they deserve to be punished. But in some cases, the overreaction has been a bit much. So we're going to spend some time talking about that in the next hour, especially since we have a number of listeners in the state of Michigan, which, of course, has been hardest hit. But in this case, we're not dealing with the mayor. We're dealing with the governor, Gretchen Whitmer, who actually has placed such restrictions that now they have to rope off parts of the store if they have, for example, garden centers or nurseries or things like that. One friend of this particular writer went into first Lowe's, then Walmart. At Lowe's was prevented from even buying a can of paint, but was allowed to purchase caulk. At Walmart, was not allowed to buy a couch, but was able to buy a flat-screen television. And so after a while, you just say, what? And since some of our listeners are in the Upper Peninsula in Michigan, this one was even more confusing because the child car seats were roped off at this Walmart. And the question being asked is, if car seats for children are mandated by law, how can those people in Michigan actually purchase them? And how can parents with small children, especially single parents, even be able to go out and buy food if they can't buy the car seat, which is mandated by the government? So you're starting to see some things that just don't pass any level of common sense. In addition to this, of course, we have many examples. Probably the best one out of Colorado is a video which is available that you can actually see, in which you have this individual who is playing catch with his daughter in a park. The police officers come up to him while his 6-year-old daughter watches on this softball field. They handcuff him and take him away. Now, since then, the department has actually apologized for this. But if nothing else, this individual, Matt Mooney, who turns out also is a former Colorado State Patrol officer and knew his rights, said that his 6-year-old daughter was scared to see her father placed in handcuffs. But he also says she's learned that our constitutional rights are worth standing up for. She got to witness a violation of civil rights. She got to witness an unlawful order by the police. And, of course, even the most egregious examples in this country are paled in comparison to what we're seeing in other countries. Of course, in China, they've been using cell phone coverage to track individuals. South Korea has used those cell phone coverage as well. One of these articles shows a drone flying by some people looking out their balcony and making sure that nobody was able to gather together. Some of these governments are using ankle monitors to prevent anybody with COVID-19 or even somebody that may or may not have been exposed to it from leaving their home. And so then you have all sorts of examples surfacing, even from Europe. In France, for example, they've postponed elections in Bolivia and Peru. In, of course, South America, they've postponed elections. You had in Hungary, I mentioned this one before, the prime minister there was given all sorts of opportunity to impose various kinds of sanctions. And even in Belgium, again, a European country, are now requisitioning cell phone companies' location tracking data to make sure that people are not straying too far from their homes. People, of course, being stopped in the streets and in their cars at major checkpoints to catch people that maybe their cell phone monitoring had missed. And you can see that Big Brother is alive and well, in large part justified by this coronavirus pandemic. So let's take a break. When we come back, since we talked a little bit about what's going on in church, I want to hear from Michael Youssef. What has their church been doing? How can we find some faith in the time of crisis? We'll also spend a little bit of time talking about his new book, Saving Christianity. And then later in the next hour, we'll be talking about some of the victims of the war in Africa now facing not only the devastation of war, but also the devastation of the lockdowns that are taking place and the poverty that has struck them as well. So we have a lot more to cover. Hope you'll join us. And if you'd like to read some of the articles we've been mentioning, all available at our website, pointofview.net. We'll be back right after this.
When you give to Point of View, does it make a difference? Jeremy Dies would tell you that it does. He grew up listening to Point of View in the back seat of his mom's car, and it helped to shape his thinking.
I had parents that were able to sit across from me at the dinner table after we listened to Marlon Maddox and Kerby Anderson years ago and think through what the scriptures say about these issues of current significance in our lives. That's only possible because Point of View has come along and ministered into my life and made me who I am today. And here I am today defending religious liberty, partly because Marlon Maddox and Penna Dexter and Kerby Anderson were the ones that were pushing me towards all that. They taught me how to think through these issues. They didn't tell me what to think. They taught me how to think.
Each gift you give will change lives. Not every Point of View listener will become a Jeremy, but if they listen for very long, they will be changed. And that will change how they impact and affect the lives of the people around them. So make that decision to change a life today. Join the Truth Team and boldly stand for truth in a world of lies, distortion, and information manipulation. Go to pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me on this Monday broadcast. I hope you had a good Easter. I know it was probably the most unusual Easter any of us have ever faced before. So this hour, we're going to spend some time, first of all, talking with our good friend, Michael Youssef. And then we're going to get into some of those issues that are so important, especially as we're starting to think about whether or not to move away from a lockdown. What kind of end game, what kind of exit strategy do we have? That is my commentary today. It also relates to, of course, two of the articles we've posted on our website, so we will spend some time talking about that. But without any further ado, I wanted to go to Michael Youssef, who's been on the program with us so many times before, founder and president of Leading the Way. Also, of course, the founding pastor of the Church of the Apostles in Atlanta, Georgia. We're going to talk about how we can find faith in a time of crisis. Also want to spend just a little bit of time talking about his newest book, Saving Christianity. But Michael Youssef, it is always great to have you on the program with us.
Oh, Kerby, what a great honor to be with you again, brother. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, here is a man that you are somebody who has been broadcasting around the world, reaching people through technology. But I suspect you had to broadcast now even to your own congregation there in Atlanta. So this is probably the most unusual Easter you and I have ever had. Isn't that true?
Oh, absolutely. And I am trying. I really thought long and hard that 71 years. Now, I don't remember, of course, when I was 1 and 2, but I'm sure my parents took me to church on Easter Sunday. I don't think I've ever missed the Easter Sunday celebration, the resurrection of Jesus, ever. That is not in the congregation, and this is the first time ever. And the whole world is 185 countries. And so now I'm speaking to audiences by the millions on our dedicated satellite channel called Malakot, or Kingdom Sat in Arabic, in 200 million homes. And I'm speaking to them on a regular basis now because I read stuff from the middle of the day. They're going through the same thing. Everywhere in the world. And so, yes, I did have to speak to them. The last 3 Sundays, that's so hard to speak to an empty big church, but God really is using this. We are just, our audience, online audience, has gone up by about 1,000%.
Yes, that's what I've heard. All sorts of people saying I'm reaching more people than I've ever reached before. A little bit later, maybe we'll even get to some of this after you interview, or maybe certainly in the second hour, because in some places, churches are being fined, churchgoers are being fined. We'll talk about that. And of course, we'll get into much of that with Kelly Shackelford when we spend some time with him later in the week. But what is the message you're bringing right now to not only your congregation, but around the world? Because it seems to me that we should not be individuals who have a spirit of fear, but instead should have power and love and a sound mind or self-control. But in the midst of some of the faith that we need to exercise, there are a lot of people that are fearful, aren't they?
No question about it. And the spirit of fear is a very powerful thing. As a matter of fact, the Apostle Paul recognized that spirit in his own disciple, Timothy. He tell that Timothy is easily intimidated and easily falls into that fear mode, and that is why he writes definitively saying that spirit is not from God. God does not give us a spirit of fear. And then, on the other hand, Jesus said, who of you by worrying, he can add a day to your life. I always say, it is appointed that day unto man to die once. That day is appointed in heaven, the day we're born, the day we die, appointed in heaven. Now, it doesn't mean we'll become careless, but nonetheless, it's worry is not going to, or fear is not going to change that date or the cause by which we go. But we are, in 2 Corinthians, Paul says, we are eager to go. We're not worried about it, fearful. If the Lord takes me home tomorrow, I got my bags packed. But at the same time, we need to understand, as a people, my very first message to the congregation is the question you always ask, and it's not ended up going viral, millions. You ask the question, Lord, any crisis, personal crisis, anything that is not of my own doing, that is not the consequence of my own sin, whether it's personal or community or city or nation or world, global, as we have, you ask the question, Lord, what is it that you want to teach me? What can I learn from this? How can I grow in this? How can I know you better? And on and on and on. And so I basically preached the first message, and this whole thing started from Joel chapter 2.
Good.
And Joel, at the time, they were experiencing, as the people in East Africa experiencing right now. I mean, they were having these giant locusts. And he talks about these locusts as if it's an army and a military, like a military force, but it's not. It's a locust, and was devastating the land. And so, what does he do? He said, blow the trumpet in Zion, sound the alarm in my holy hill. Let all who live in the land, tremble, and for the day of the Lord is coming and is close at hand. So, in other words, he's saying, look, if you're not ready for a small potato like this, how are you going to be ready for the day of judgment?
Wow.
And so every crisis that comes our way, it should be an alarm bell. Are you ready for the day of judgment? Are you prepared to meet the Lord? If he turns up tomorrow, turns up this afternoon, are you ready? So these are the questions the believers ought to be asking. Instead of cowering in fear, that we should sound the alarm. He said, blow the shofar, blow the trumpet, call the people together, gather them, so we can't gather physically, but we can gather spiritually and begin to pray and begin to seek the Lord. And he said, tear your hearts and not your garments. In other words, he's saying, look, the tearing of the garment is a symbolic thing, just as the fabric tears apart, it's sort of the symbolism of the tearing of the heart on the inside, the grief and the mourning and the pain. And people like in Israel, like we are, we tended to keep the tradition, but nothing happening on the inside. The heart was not being changed. It's just tearing the clothes. And he's saying, look, don't tear your hair out. Tear the idols out of your life.
Good.
Take this as an opportunity for self-examinations. What idols, whether it be sport or entertainment, what is the one thing that has occupied our lives and our time, our energy, our resources, and how we prepare for the judgment? This is a warning sign, and we must take it that way. Otherwise, it will be literally a waste. Manuel, the man who was the mayor of Chicago, is known for saying that don't waste
a crisis. Yeah, let's take a break and we'll come back and continue with Dr. Michael Youssef right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The country has effectively been in lockdown for weeks, but many are asking, when will all of this change? President Trump optimistically hoped Americans could be in church on Easter. Yesterday was a reminder that we aren't even close to bringing normalcy to our society. We need to start talking about an end game, or to use a military term, we need an exit strategy. Epidemiologists and infectious disease specialists rightly focus on the medical health of humans, but economists and politicians need to focus on the economic and social health of a country that has been shut down. One of the best ideas I've seen came from New York Times column by Thomas Friedman, who writes about a plan to get America back to work. He quotes Dr. David Katz, a public health expert at Yale University. He proposes a targeted approach in which we reboot the economy while also calling for the most vulnerable to shield themselves from infection. He also calls for establishing mobile testing and temperature check systems like Korea. Ronald Klein, who served as President Obama's Ebola response coordinator, writes that it is time to reopen production facilities, even if it has to be done with fewer workers per shift, who are spread further apart. We could even allow some stores to open with limited capacity and hours. You know, these are good ideas that the president and the governors should consider, especially since all of these ideas come from people who certainly are not fans of Donald Trump. But this is an election year. The moment the president or governors mention these ideas, they will face a firestorm of criticism. We need an endgame, but there will be a political price to pay for implementing it. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Pleased to have with us for just a bit longer Dr. Michael Youssef, again, founder and president of Leading the Way, and you can go to ltw.org. Of course, we have that link on our website, pointofview.net. And Dr. Youssef, just before we talk about your book, Saving Christianity, when people go to ltw.org, first of all, of course, they can find some of the messages, including your most recent one, Healthy Living in a Sick World. But also you have a prayer movement, and I think if nothing else, this pandemic has caused a lot of people to reevaluate their priorities, and one of those is the priority of prayer. And so you've put together a prayer movement called Awake America. Tell us more, if you might.
Yes, actually, we were about to launch that way before the coronavirus ever hit, and because it's just a burden of my heart for people to pray for our nation. We are so divided. We really are not just divided. We are divided into too many parts, and even the Christians. I mean, they are themselves are in trouble in terms of division. And so we started this stuff last year. We said we're going to launch it 2020, but the coronavirus just brought it forth. And our teams in Australia, they have Awake Australia, and in our team in the UK, they have Awake UK, and Canada the same way. And we're trying to do this globally, rather, but we're focusing here in the United States. So we pray. This is an election year. There's just so many falsehoods have been circulating. There's so many things that are really ungodly, unhealthy for the nation that could bring about the wrath of God, literally. I mean, it's like, I think it was Mrs. Billy Graham, Ruth Graham, who said, if God does not judge us, he'll have to apologize to Sodom and Gomorrah. and we're really there. So the burden of my heart is to call upon God's people to plead with God that He would send us an awakening, because only a Holy Spirit opening the eyes of the blind is going to make the difference. So we started this prayer movement, and tens of thousands already signed up, and we are aiming for a largest number possible by the end of this year to people who would literally covenant to either pray daily and or walk around their neighborhoods in prayer, or walk around their campus and pray. And anyway, there's different categories and different things to sign up for, and just plead with God to have mercy on us, because right now, sometimes we've prayed for a long time, God bless America, God bless America. I really think now, as a naturalized citizen of this country, I feel honored to be part. It's a huge privilege to call myself an American, and a dream I had since I was a boy. And that privilege has responsibility, and that is, we say, God, have mercy on America. And that's what my conviction, the conviction of my team, is that we're asking the Lord to have mercy on us and to remember us afresh and to send us a Holy Spirit visitation.
So again, we have talked with you in the past about a variety of different books, A Hidden Enemy, as well as Counting Stars. But this new book, Saving Christianity, is, again, kind of fits very well with your prayer strategy, because we live in times where people are facing a lot of anxiety. And I think it's striking that the Apostle Paul talks about anxiety in Philippians 4. The Apostle Peter talks about anxiety in 1 Peter 5. So they anticipated that people would certainly go through tough times. And we're not going through, in this country, the kind of persecution that Christians are around the world. But you've been very concerned about the future of this country. Even though you were born in Egypt, you're a naturalized citizen. You are certainly appreciative of what this country has provided. But a lot of that comes not from our political leaders, but comes from our churches and the real need for us to save Christianity. Can you explain?
Well, the reason the book is called Save Christianity, ? And it's out of my 42 books, this is my most controversial book. And I mean this in the truest sense of the word, because I feel if the Lord takes me home tomorrow, it's my legacy. Every person and every group of people who try to water down the gospel, make it palatable to the culture, change the power of the gospel, take away the sting of repentance from the gospel. Every time a person does that, now I go through history in that book, I show historically all the way from the beginning, but all the way here to in the United States, particularly with Henry Fosdick and so on. Every one of those people who try to modify the gospel, change the gospel, says, we're doing this to save Christianity.
Oh, yes.
And the argument in my book is, you can't save Christianity by modifying it and watering it down and changing it, and by denying the biblical truth. I mean, the big thing now is that folks are saying that, all religions, 60%, according to Barna, of believers, or they call themselves professing Christians, think that there are many ways to God. Think about this. There are 6%, according to his latest study, 6% of Americans have a biblical worldview. And less than 16% of professing Christians have biblical worldview. So I'm showing the pitfalls, the universalism, and all the isms that ought to be wasms, that are just really coming, that is invading the evangelical churches. I fought that war in the mainline denomination 40 years ago, because that's where I was, and we fought those wars, and we lost, and we left the mainline and become evangelical. Now I'm seeing the same thing happen in evangelical church.
Me too.
Church after church after church. One large church here in Georgia, a well-known big church, not in Atlanta, but is in the state of Georgia. Well, they left the Southern Baptist Convention, and the reason the pastor said is, I don't know what the truth is, but I know what love is.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a theme that's been played by so many so-called evangelical pastors. So That whole book is answering those questions and calling the church to turn back to biblical orthodoxy. You cannot save Christianity. Christianity does not need to be saved. Christianity is Christ, and Christ is our Savior. We can't save him.
Yes, and again, one of the things I've noticed, again, since some of us are the old guys around the table, is that we've seen this before, people trying to make the Bible teach evolution, make the Bible teach liberation theology, make the Bible, teach pluralism. And in some respects, I know I'm going to be doing a commentary on that book, because when you did that one on the hidden enemy, where you were talking about the enemies on the outside, that's humanist and atheist, but those are all kind of internal enemies and the enemies of the gospel from, of course, obviously Islam. But this is another enemy, and this is where individuals, even inside the church, even in the pulpits, are compromising biblical faith. So if people would like to know more about all of this, we, of course, have a link to your website that has all of that information. We also have a link so if people would like to find the book in their bookstore, they can. But if not, we have it both in paperback and Kindle. But one more time, just before we let you go, because I know you're a busy man, let's, if we can, talk about what people will find when they land on your website, ltw.org, because all sorts of great messages are there, and people can learn from that even during the week.
Yeah, absolutely. And they can download the app. Everything we do is for free. We don't charge for anything. In fact, even the books we don't charge. We just say give to Vineyard. But our desire, our longing, and the longing of my partners is that we want people to be equipped with the truth. And in many ways, we are sort of want to serve great ministries like yours. And so when they go in, they're going to find messages about how to overcome fear, how to live by faith, and how to trust in God, in difficult times. And these are very practical, not kind of armchair theologian advice, but it's very practical from my own personal experience. I was just saying, Easter Sunday, I was talking about the people who would say to me, how does it feel to be speaking to millions of people every Sunday, especially on the Kingdom Sat around the world? And I said, the first thing occurred to me when somebody asked me that question, I think back of the rebellious teenager. I think back of the person who is spiritually damaged good. I think back of my past failures. I think back of so many things, and defecting of the faith in one stage and turning against God. And I think of all that, and then I begin to praise God because he is the God of the second chances. And
That's so good.
The second chance that he gave me that made it possible for me to speak to people. And I have only one message: Jesus saves.
That's so good. Dr. Michael Youssef, always great to have you on the program. And again, we encourage you to go to ltw.org, find out more about Leading the Way and, of course, the Church of the Apostles. And great to have you with us today here on Point of View.
Thank you so much.
We're going to take a break, and we'll get into a lot of news related to the pandemic, and many of those articles are on the website, pointofview.net, so you can find those, and we'll be back right after this.
2020. Is there anything important happening this year? Well, not unless you consider major disputes in various Christian denominations, international tensions over a flu epidemic, economic uncertainties, and a presidential election important. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It's easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Are you ready for an end game? Are you ready to come out of this lockdown? This is one of the questions that, of course, the president and the governors are going to have to address. Certainly, the president can begin to ease off some of that, but ultimately that becomes a responsibility of governors and mayors and others. And I would love to get your thoughts about that. But one of the articles we've posted here is by George Gilder. It's been on the program with us before. It's been a while. But he points out that we need politicians in a pandemic because he points out that the U.S. economy is cratered maybe less by the coronavirus than by the response to it, driven by, he says, the undemocratic idea that science should rule, even when much of the science and the data behind it remains in dispute. Now, in just a few minutes, I'm going to go to a statement today by the Surgeon General saying that they're using now not data from other countries, but from our own. And so that might help us with some of those questions. But he says, even when we talk about the fighting the pandemic kind of like a war, which, again, I've pointed out maybe isn't the best analogy. Even when we do fight a war, you can certainly admit, as he does here, that admirals and generals still have to defer to civilian authority, to the president, who's commander-in-chief. And he says that the demands of healthcare experts are not greater than the demands of the economy for a very simple reason. The healthcare system is not separate from the economy, but a crucial part of it. The healthcare system saves lives. The economy provides everything we need to live. And damage done to the economy, if sustained, could easily cost more lives, as we've pointed out on this program. So he says, common sense might be to consider that if the disease threatens to kill certain people, say the elderly, that may already even be afflicted with disease, we should maybe try to sequester those individuals and protect those, but others should proceed with our work. That's the article that I have today on the website, my Viewpoints commentaries, entitled Lockdown and Endgame. And that's exactly what is being proposed by a number of individuals. I quote from Thomas Friedman, hardly a fan of Donald Trump, who himself has put together a piece on a plan to get America back to work, quoting from David Katz at Yale University, his plan. Then you have Ronald Klain, who actually was on President Obama's Ebola response coordinator staff, actually working on this idea that maybe we could reopen production facilities. So this is the kind of discussion that needs to take place. But as I point out in my commentary, even though these are individuals who are hardly fans of the president or even fans of many of, say, the Republican governors, as soon as the president or some of the governors begin to implement any of that, it's an election season, so you can see the kind of criticism that they will face. But nevertheless, George Gilder's piece, which you might want to read in its entirety, says, look, Dr. Anthony Fauci is undoubtedly a fine physician, but he's not in a position to cure what ails us. We're beset by more than a virus. We're beset by bad ideas about what government can and should do and about who should be making crucial decisions. So reminding us that these are going to have to be decisions made by individuals that are looking at the economy, looking at public policy, and certainly taking into account some of these medical issues. And that, of course, will, in just a few minutes, get us to one of the controversies that a lot of people are talking about right now between Donald Trump, the president, and Dr. Anthony Fauci, of course, working with the NIH. But another piece, and it's the second one I've quoted from here as well, is called The Coronavirus versus the Greatest Country on Earth. And these are the editors of the Washington Free Beacon, who first of all point out how, whether it's Rachel Maddow or the Center for American Progress or Hillary Clinton or a variety of others that have said this is America at its worst. And if nothing else, the editors are saying, if nothing else, what this might actually show is just the opposite, America at its best. And they use the example at World War II, how ill-prepared the United States was. We had an army, and I didn't realize this, smaller than Portugal's. We were slow to respond. After Pearl Harbor, though, the decision was, let's get to work. And 12 million men enlisted. Factories churned out over 300,000 aircraft. And in a few short years, America became the mightiest military in the history of the world. And, of course, back then we were building planes, but they point out now we're making tests. And just a month ago, America had gone from maybe a few thousand people tested to now 2.2 million. Matter of fact, I just looked at that number. It's now 2.8 million if you go to the sick map for Johns Hopkins. And he says we're on pace to do 1 million more every week. Germany is testing about a third as many people. North Korea, 10 times fewer. The United States is larger, but so it has a lot further to go. But the growth in its testing regime is breathtaking. So let's, if just a minute, talk about all the good that this country has done, not only around the world, but even right now in terms of producing vaccines. How about all the different companies that have, for example, some of these distilleries that have decided instead of making alcohol, they'll make hand sanitizer. How about some of these textile companies or even MyPillow? Michael Lindell, instead of being criticized for turning over 3/4 of his production to producing masks instead of pillows, all are good examples. And then when we look at these viruses that are out there, the vaccines that we have produced, but even the vaccines right now that are being developed, you have some of those that in the past have been developed for HIV and hepatitis C, but the best estimates are about 78 different vaccines are in some aspect of production, and half of those are being produced, guess what? In North American laboratories. And we'll give credit, and since I gave credit just a minute ago to Mike Lindell, who would obviously be a conservative, how about credit to a person who would obviously be considered a liberal progressive, Bill Gates, with his 7 vaccine factories. So anyway, the editors, and this is in our second article, if you'd like to read it in its entirety, say that some would prefer to say that the coronavirus crisis has shown America at its worst. We should be more like China, they argue, welding sick people into their own homes. No, it's obviously being facetious there. Despite the long road ahead, however, we think the coronavirus reveals America at its best. Bloody but unbowed, facing this fearsome new enemy with overwhelming might. So I thought that was a really good piece. If nothing else, make you a little more proud of some of the things happening in this country. And sometimes the good news doesn't get covered. Have you noticed that? I noticed that even this weekend when I was looking at the sick map. Now, if you don't know what that is you can go to like Drudge, it call it the sick map, or you can type in sick map, or you can type in Johns Hopkins map. What it is it gives you an overview on what is happening around the world, and then it breaks it down for each country. On the left-hand side, it has the number of individuals that actually have contracted the coronavirus. On the right-hand side, you had 2 columns, one on the number of people that have died, and then the number of people that have recovered. And over the weekend, I noticed something missing. The number of people recovered. That's not on there anymore. Well, if you actually click on the right buttons, you can eventually find it. It's actually hidden behind the one on the number of people killed. So you have to go to the one that shows the number of deaths, click the button over, and then you get the number of people recovered. Now, was that intentional, or were they just running out of space? Because the extra column that used to have total recovered, which now is up to 444,000 people worldwide that have recovered from this coronavirus. You now have another column on total tested. Not that that's not helpful, but it certainly leaves off one of, I think, the more positive aspects of this. And I correlate that with something I'll mention just before we take the break, and that is our friends at the Wall Street Journal have a column called Politicizing Coronavirus Science, in which they point out that we really do need good, honest science, but they point out that Nature magazine published an editorial which lambasted those who erroneously have been associating the virus with Wuhan and China. Now, the Journal criticizes Donald Trump, of course, but also politicians in the UK for saying that China bears responsibility. Well, the reality is, as we've talked on this program, it does. And yet this is an attempt to try to be politically correct by one of the most, perhaps the most prestigious science journal in the world. And, of course, they even in this particular piece go on to point out that even the fact that we call this COVID-19 was, I think, an attempt to distract the origin from China, because if you look at the actual virus, it's called SARS-2, SARS and COVID-2, because after all, it is a SARS type of virus. But the World Health Organization, according to this quote, wanted to avoid any reference to SARS for political reasons because, of course, SARS back into the early 2000s originated in China. So now we have just one more example of politicizing the coronavirus, in this case, politicizing coronavirus science. We'll have more to say about that with the Surgeon General right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
For a few more minutes, and let me just mention that in the next hour, I'm going to spend some time talking with Dr. Tom Catena, and he will actually join us from a satellite phone in Africa, and we'll talk about Africa's forgotten war victims. But if you think it's bad enough for those who have been orphaned because of war, civil strife, and all of the rest, it's even worse because we're talking about, of course, the lockdown that has taken place. And so if you think you're struggling right now, just imagine what it's like in the third world. So I thought it might bring some perspective to what is happening in our country, but also just a little bit of a look at what is happening in other countries facing this pandemic as well. And then we'll get back into some other the issues. One of those things is, of course, there's been a back and forth between Dr. Anthony Fauci and President Donald Trump. So we'll get to that in the next hour. But when I was just a minute ago talking about this idea of political correctness has hit the Surgeon General today, and this is a good example of what the mainstream press is covering instead of what it should be covering. And first of all, you have to understand that Surgeon General Jerome Adams is African American. So first of all, understand that. So one of the criticisms he's all of a sudden received over the weekend was that he was and I've heard him say this for about a week. So it's almost like a memo went out saying now this is a time when we need to criticize Dr. Fauci, criticize the Surgeon General because they're associated with Donald Trump. And so all of a sudden, the individual who in the past has sometimes tried to maybe use colloquial language to really encourage individuals, especially in his own African-American community, but also in the Hispanic community, that even if you think you're bulletproof, do it for, he says, your abuela, do it for your granddaddy, do it for your big mama, do it for your pop-pop. I've heard him say that a number of times. Even when he said it, I thought, okay, you might get criticized for it. Well, he was, as you might imagine. And then it goes on to even say that those individuals that find themselves in the Hispanic American community, but especially the African American community, they should not drink or smoke. They need to follow the government's guidelines and those kinds of things. And, of course, there's a reason he singled out Black and Latinos, is because they are dying at a disproportionate rate. Let's just use a couple of numbers here. Those of you that live in Illinois, let me just take Chicago, for example. About a third of the population in Chicago are African Americans, but 2/3 of all the people that have died in Chicago are African American. Let's go over to Wisconsin, Milwaukee County, for example. 26% of the population is African American, but 73% of those who died are African American. How about some of you there in Louisiana? 32% African American, 70% of the deaths in Louisiana are African American. Michigan, one more, because I'm going to talk about your governor here in just a minute. 14% African American in Michigan, primarily located in some of the cities, 41% of the deaths. So while he was trying to make a case, maybe he could have not used phrases like Big Mama or Pop Pop. He was trying to emphasize the fact that you may think that you are not going to suffer from the coronavirus, but you need to take care of this because maybe you're at least concerned about your grandparents, even if you're not concerned about yourself. Anyway, he's been criticized roundly for that. But the thing he should have been quoted for is the fact that he, and I'm sure this will show up in the press conference today, is pointing out now that for the first time, some of these models that we've been using, you know, the ones that haven't been very accurate, now we're starting to use real data. Previously, the task force, I'm reading from an article that came out just recently, was working with predictive models that were trying to, in some way or another, pull data from different cultures and different places from around the world. And so as a result, they tended to exaggerate the possible effect and impact of the virus. So now, because we have more data from places like California and New York, then we certainly have at least something that might be a more accurate predictor, which brings us back to the point I made just a minute ago. this president and these governors are going to have to make some decisions about what can or cannot be done based upon some of this. I did mention Michigan. Just for our Michigan listeners out there, you've got the governor, Gretchen Whitmer, right now. And, of course, Michigan has been one of the states hardest hit by this pandemic. But you have some of the most bizarre regulations where some of the restrictions close down some of the stores, which might be dedicated to nursery or plant. As a matter of fact, one of the individuals in this article went to test this out. First went to Lowe's, then to Walmart. At Lowe's, he was prevented from buying a can of paint, but allowed to purchase caulk. Walmart, he was not allowed to buy a couch, but could buy a big flat screen television. But the one that I found the biggest head scratcher of all is that this comes from a Walmart up there in the Upper Peninsula there in Michigan, which prevented anybody from purchasing, are you ready for this, a child car seat. Now think about this. The law mandates that children have to be sat in a car seat, but if people in Michigan are unable to buy them, how could parents with small children, especially single parents, even be able to get out to buy food? So some of these rules and regulations have just sort of gone off the rails. And it brings me to my final two pieces of material that we've posted on the website. The first one by Nick Arama, pointing out, and I'll go to our friends in Kentucky, where the governor had threatened to record license plate numbers and order a 14-day quarantine for anyone in attendance. Well, nevertheless, the people at Maryville Baptist Church went anyway. Guess what? First of all, they found nails at the entrance to the parking lot, so they pick all those up. And then the police began to record the license plate numbers for those so that they can go back and force those people into 2-week quarantine. But they were also picking up not only the license plates of the people that were in the service, but of the media. I'd love to see them force these reporters into a mandatory 2-week quarantine. But nevertheless, that's just one of those examples we've posted on the website. And the longer article comes from our good friend John Fund, who's been on the program with us before. And he points out that in some places, Easter isn't being celebrated, it's being fined. And one of those is at a Baptist church in Mississippi, which will be something we'll spend more time talking about with Kelly Shackelford, because First Liberty got involved here, where after they had a Wednesday service in which people stayed in their parked cars and received the drive-in service through a low-frequency radio station signal, nevertheless, you can hear on the video police officer saying your rights are suspended. And so that's why Kelly Shackelford and the people at First Liberty actually were able to get a temporary restraining order Saturday night so that those people could meet. And there will be hearings on that tomorrow. Of course, we'll be talking about that with Kelly. But since then, not only has First Liberty, but also Alliance Defending Freedom filing lawsuits. And in every case, these are individuals that oftentimes are in a parking lot. One of the examples out of Virginia where there's a church service that had all of 16 people spaced apart in a sanctuary that seats almost 300 people. And yet in all these different cases, there have been various fines levied. Matter of fact, the fines in one of these places, Temple Baptist Church in Greenville, the tickets were $500 tickets. So we're going to spend some more time maybe in the next hour talking about that, and certainly be talking about that with our friend Kelly Shackelford, because things seem to have gone off the rails a little bit. And while it is important to exercise social distancing, while it's good to exercise common sense, while it's good to wear a mask, in some of these places, people have, I think, substantially overreacted. So I'll talk about that in the next hour. But first, we're going to spend some time talking with Dr. Tom Catena, an individual that has been a medical missionary and is going to give us an update on what is happening in Africa. If you think we're facing some very significant crises, just imagine what they're facing. So we'll get his satellite phone call right after these important messages.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, first of all, I think y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour, let's, if we can, talk about the decisions that will be coming down shortly, recognizing that the president can do some, the governors in various states can do others, but there is a real question that is being asked right now. Can we get to the point where we're not in lockdown, where we can begin to stimulate the economy? Because this is important to individuals who have lost their jobs, who have been furloughed. It's important to the future of this economy. So my commentary today is about lockdown and the end game, because we've been in lockdown, of course, for many weeks, and many are sort of asking, when's this going to change? Of course, the hope is that maybe some of that could change by Easter. Well, that's now in our rear view mirror. So what about this? And we need to start talking about an end game or an exit strategy, if you want to use the military term. And so in today's column, I talk about the fact that there are people like Thomas Friedman who have written about a plan to get America back to work, where he's really quoting from David Katz, a public health expert at Yale University, proposing kind of a targeted approach in which we reboot the economy while still calling for some of the more vulnerable to shield themselves from infection. We're hearing more people talking about that. And then, of course, having mobile testing and temperature check systems. And, of course, we're gearing up now with more testing, which would be very helpful. Ronald Klain, who I also quote from, and this comes in a Washington Post article, he served on President Obama's Ebola response coordination team. And he says that it might be time to reopen at least the production facilities. This could be done with fewer workers per shift who are spread maybe further apart. Might even allow some stores to open with limited capacity. And while I think these are very good ideas, I don't forget that we are in an election season in a very divided country, in which, even though these ideas being proposed by people who I think could easily be called never-Trumpers, not exactly fans of the president, if the president proposed this, or even certain governors did, I think they would face a firestorm of criticism. Which brings me to another piece that I have written, which actually will come out tomorrow, which I kind of provocatively entitled Dollars versus Death. Because, you know, when you talk about the need for economists and political leaders to begin to talk about an end game, or to begin to think about what happens next, you're obviously going to have people come up with certain criticisms. And one of those cliches is you're attempting to trade dollars for death. And as a matter of fact, I, in the piece there, quote from the governor of New York, who said no one should be talking about social Darwinism for the sake of the stock market. We cannot put a dollar figure on human life. But I think even the individuals that do not support the president, for example, some of the editors of the New York Times, call this a false choice, because we recognize that shelter in place is necessary. But there's always going to be some kind of trade-off, and those trade-offs need to be considered. And so, first of all, reopening American society isn't so much about the stock market as it is about the everyday lives of millions. Because I point out that, let's just be honest for a minute, the wealthy probably could well weather the storm here of this current lockdown. But what was it? I think the statistic I saw the other day, 1/3 of Americans could not pay their rent, or did not pay their rent. I don't know how much there is there. And so if you're poor if you're the working poor, if you're in the middle class, and you have no savings to rely on, those are the people getting hurt. The wealthy people probably just pull some money out of savings and just continue on. But that's not this is not closing, this down, or this is not opening it up for the stock market. This is for the people whose lives have been affected by this. But again, a lot of people said you should never engage in trade-offs. Now, think about that for a minute, because I point out lots of examples. Let's take a couple. The bottom line is quite simple, that if you really wanted to make sure that few people die on highways, well, let's just set the national highway speed limit at 24 miles per hour. You ready to do that? Didn't think so. But the Insurance Institute of Highway Safety has found that highway fatalities rose 8.5% for every 5 miles per hour increase in a highway speed limit. Guess what? The higher the speed limit, the greater the death toll. Does that mean we can't have a 55 mile an hour, 65 mile an hour, 70 mile an hour speed limit? Of course, you understand that. Let's take another one. We recognize that cigarette smoking is probably responsible for 480,000 deaths per year. I haven't seen anybody banning it yet. Yeah, we've tried to restrict it, but we haven't banned it. We have at least 88,000 deaths each year through alcohol-related causes. Haven't heard a lot of people calling for prohibition. The point is, we make policy trade-offs all the time. And so this idea of wanting to be a purist and never, ever talking about trade-offs is not realistic. And this is what we oftentimes hope that individuals who are in policy-making positions begin to consider. And that's why I've posted that first article on needing politicians in a pandemic. So let's have this national conversation about cost and benefit, if we certainly can. And then, of course, the other one that we've been talking about is the concern that and I will talk more about this hour, just even the loss of freedom and liberty, because what we're starting to see now is that politicians, government leaders who want to make sure that they can keep people safe and ultimately want to exercise power over people are quite willing to shut down all sorts of things. And there's almost been a decision on the part of some mayors and some governors to sort of lay siege to our civil liberties. Let's just face it, if 6 months ago I'd come on this program and said, what we're going to have here because of this virus is that we're going to have huge sectors of our society closed down. People are going to have to stay at home in quarantine, that we won't even have church services on Easter, you would have said, oh, come on. And that's, of course, exactly what we're dealing with right now. And so in some respects, as I've quoted before from some people, that the problem is that once a human society sometimes loses certain freedoms, it's difficult to get them back, because oftentimes surrendering freedom was in order to address a particular external threat, which might have been exaggerated, but nevertheless was justified. And as a result, sometimes citizens are all too willing to give up their freedom. And unfortunately, we can also see that governments are often very reluctant to give up the power that they were granted during that crisis. So those are just a few of the kinds of issues that we're going to have to address. And a little bit later this hour, we'll talk about that. And those give you a little bit of a preview of a few of the things that I have either written about and recorded, and some of which you'll see later in the week. But if you have an interest in finding out a little bit more, simply go to the website, pointofview.net. Click on the Viewpoint section there, Lockdown and Endgame. You can read that one today. And if you don't already receive it in your inbox, click on that button so that you receive my commentaries every single day. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The country has effectively been in lockdown for weeks, but many are asking, when will all of this change? President Trump optimistically hoped Americans could be in church on Easter. Yesterday was a reminder that we aren't even close to bringing normalcy to our society. We need to start talking about an end game, or to use a military term, we need an exit strategy. Epidemiologists and infectious disease specialists rightly focus on the medical health of humans, but economists and politicians need to focus on the economic and social health of a country that has been shut down. One of the best ideas I've seen came from New York Times column by Thomas Friedman, who writes about a plan to get America back to work. He quotes Dr. David Katz, a public health expert at Yale University. He proposes a targeted approach in which we reboot the economy while also calling for the most vulnerable to shield themselves from infection. He also calls for establishing mobile testing and temperature check systems like Korea. Ronald Klein, who served as President Obama's Ebola response coordinator, writes that it is time to reopen production facilities, even if it has to be done with fewer workers per shift, who are spread further apart. We could even allow some stores to open with limited capacity and hours. You know, these are good ideas that the president and the governors should consider, especially since all of these ideas come from people who certainly are not fans of Donald Trump. But this is an election year. The moment the president or governors mention these ideas, they will face a firestorm of criticism. We need an endgame, but there will be a political price to pay for implementing it. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
May not be able to connect up with Dr. Tom Catena. As a matter of fact, that was one of the individuals who we actually thought would be in studio, but of course you know how that works out when individuals that think they were going to come over here, of course, end up being grounded. So we were trying to connect up with him with satellite phone, and maybe we'll catch him later, but I thought I would address one of the issues in the news, and that is the conflict, apparently, between the president, Donald Trump, and the Dr. Anthony Fauci. And, of course, a lot of this surfaces simply from an interview that he did on Sunday, in which he pointed out, obviously, when he was asked a very pointed question of whether or not if we could have implemented some of this earlier, would this have saved lives? And I think the obvious answer is yes. And, of course, that is the case. But let me give you the direct quote, because on CNN particularly, but he was asked this elsewhere as well. He said, of course, it's very difficult to go back and say, I mean, obviously, you could logically say that if you had a process that was ongoing and you started mitigation earlier, you could have saved lives. Obviously, no one's going to deny that. But what goes into these kind of decisions is complicated. And then I noticed a little bit later, he even pointed out the fact that if we had been right from the very beginning and shut things down, it may have been a little different, but there's a lot of pushback from shutting things down back then. And so the argument that he was making is one that I think we would obviously agree with, that if we knew what we know now, certainly we would have wanted to implement that earlier. And so you don't just have Dr. Anthony Fauci saying that. You even had Dr. Deborah Birx say that if we had actually understood the nature of this virus, we wouldn't certainly have done this way, because we would have recognized how much more infectious and dangerous it was. But when you were working with faulty data, sensor data, as I talked about, was it now almost 12 weeks ago in one of the first columns I wrote on this subject from China, then that is the case. So obviously that is. And so now the drumbeat this week is, of course, is the president going to fire Dr. Anthony Fauci? I really doubt that. But more importantly, was the president irresponsible for not taking those early warnings? Now, I will want to add to the conversation here the fact that on January 21st, Dr. Anthony Fauci, because I have this video, said this is not a major threat to the people of the United States, and this is not something that the citizens of the United States should be worried about right now. So that's January 21st. That's just a few days before when the president actually shut down travel from China. So, again, you can say that the president maybe minimized some of these dangers. Certainly, the doctor may have minimized some of those dangers. Some of the people in the press, when the president did take some of those actions, felt that these were draconian, that they were uncalled for. It was an example of xenophobia, an example of racism, an example of kind of an authoritarian temptation on the part of Donald Trump. But I put together kind of a pretend timeline, and this is all fiction, but let me just have it come up for a minute. Let's just assume that the president did act much earlier than he did. So Friday, January 17th, Donald Trump halts flights from China. Sunday, January 19th, Democrats are on the talk shows complaining about the fact that he halted flights from China and that he did it simply because he was trying to distract from the impeachment trial. Monday, January 20th, he then decides to halt flights from most of Europe. Tuesday, January 21st, all the Democratic senators say that was enough. Now all of them will vote to remove Donald Trump. Wednesday, January 22nd, President Donald Trump calls for a lockdown of the U.S. and calls for all the governors to exercise social distancing on January 22nd. By the way, just one day after when Anthony Fauci made that statement that this is not a major threat. Thursday, January 23rd, business leaders from all over the country meet with the president and actually express their concerns about this attempted lockdown. They remove themselves from the meeting early because they are shocked that now the president is basically calling for something that would actually shut down most of the economy. By Friday, January 24th, Vice President Mike Pence is now tapped to head up the coronavirus task force. On Sunday, January 26th, Democrats on the talk shows begin to talk about the authoritarian actions of Donald Trump and how this just illustrates the incredible danger that he poses to the rest of the country. Monday, January 27th, Nancy Pelosi, now because Mike Pence has gone along with this, announces that the House will now investigate Mike Pence and consider whether or not to actually call for his impeachment. Wednesday, January 29th, the Evangelical Advisory Board, concerned about some of these actions, meet with Donald Trump. A number of the pastors leave the meeting and in front of the microphone say they're going to step down from the Evangelical Advisory Board because Donald Trump has told them that they will probably also be closing down church services, even on Easter. By Tuesday, February 4th, the president gives his State of the Union address to a round of boos from both sides of the aisle, and by the end of his speech announces that he is going to leave office and let Vice President Mike Pence serve as the president. The next day, the House continues its investigation of Mike Pence, determining whether or not he should be impeached. Now, of course, that's all hypothetical, but you can imagine if some of those things were taken 2 weeks or even a week earlier than they were, the kind of reaction that would have come from this country. And I think it illustrates again that if the president had taken actions earlier, it would have probably been justification for even more than just the Democrats voting for his removal from office. You can even anticipate a scenario in which Mitt Romney says, not only am I going to vote against this president and vote for him to be removed from office, but I'm also now identifying as many Republicans as I can to also vote for his removal from office. And yet, of course, here we are with an economy that is shut down, with church services that did not take place yesterday. And now the argument has moved from he reacted too early with too much of an authoritarian kind of mindset to now he didn't react early enough. And again, let me remind you that we have on record, I have that tape that you can watch for yourself if you want, in which Dr. Anthony Fauci on January 21st said this is not a major threat to the people of the United States, and this is not something that the citizens of the United States should be worried about right now. So just a great illustration of the fact that no matter what he did, he was going to be criticized. And, of course, it's a political year, so that is certainly the case. We've now been able to make a connection with Dr. Tom Catena, native of Amsterdam, New York, a town that I go through every year when I go and speak at Camp of the Woods. He has been over, of course, first of all in Kenya and now in Sudan in the Nuba Mountains. He is actually the only surgeon in a region about twice the size of Massachusetts that serves about 1.3 million people, as many of the workers were actually having to leave. He decided to stay and is chairing the African Mission Healthcare Nuba 2020. So, Dr. Tom Catena, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Yes, thank you. Great to be here with you.
Might just mention that we have you kind of on a satellite phone, and since we're coming to a break, if I can keep you after this break, that's what we will do, and get a little bit of a story on that, because we want to talk about Africa's forgotten war victims. And, of course, at a time when so many of us are facing this pandemic, if you think your particular circumstances are difficult, imagine what it's like for those individuals in these war-torn regions. So we're going to come back and spend a little bit of time talking with Dr. Tom Catena. And if you find yourself saying, I'd like to read a little bit more about some of the things you've been talking about in terms of the coronavirus pandemic, we have those articles available on our website, pointofview.net. We'll talk about how we can be praying for Dr. Catena, for those in that region, what you can do to give, to help, and all of the rest, because I certainly appreciate his good work there. And then we'll come back and finish off with a few other comments about some of these other topics related to the pandemic. So a lot more to cover, and we will do so right after the break. If you find yourself wanting to know a little bit more about Dr. Catena or about the material that we covered with Dr. Michael Youssef in the first hour, it's all available at our website, pointofview.net. My commentary is there today, as well as a video for you to watch and a number of other resources. So visit the website, pointofview.net. When we come back from the break, we'll have a short conversation with him on his sat phone, and then we'll get back into some of the issues in the news. All that coming up right after this.
(2020). Is there anything important happening this year? Well, not unless you consider major disputes in various Christian denominations, international tensions over a flu epidemic, economic uncertainties, and a presidential election important. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It's easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team. and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, and if you're just joining us, we're going to be talking now to Dr. Tom Catena, who's on a satellite phone. I recognize it's not perfect, but it gives you a chance to really understand what is happening in Africa. If you go to our website, pointofview.net, we have a link to African Mission Healthcare. And if this is something that is an area for you to, first of all, pray about and even donate to, let me encourage you to do so. As you go there, you'll see that He is the winner of a very significant prize. We were hoping we'd have him in studio, but we have him by satellite phone. So, Dr. Catena, thank you for joining us, and tell us what's going on down on the ground there, because as I mentioned before you joined us, the only surgeon that I can understand is serving, 1.3 million people in a region about twice the size of Massachusetts? Tell us more.
Yeah, that's true, Kirby. It's a pleasure to be here with you guys. We've got a 435-bed mission hospital here in Sudan, in the mountains, and we've been operating since March 2008. We've been here a little more than 12 years, and we're really quite busy through many years of civil war and other disruptions. We've been here throughout, treating all manner of problems that come our way, whether it's still hospitals, whatever people doorstep to get this care of.
And so, again, you're talking about trying to treat and save, thousands of children and adults because of everything from the Civil War to conflict, disease. As I've pointed out before, this pandemic has made difficult situations even worse. You may be isolated from some of that, but talk about some of the challenges you're facing right now in the hospital.
Probably our biggest challenge always, whether it's flooding or no flooding, is logistics. So just putting the field out here. We just got our supply of medicines for the year. This came in last week, and we've been waiting. I made that order back in August of last year, and we've been waiting since then to get this order in. We had to buy the materials in Nairobi, which is 2 countries away. We had to travel from Nairobi by truck to Uganda, into South Sudan, all the way through South Sudan, up to the mountains. That touches all those countries. And the major problem was the dirt road in South Sudan was flooded out until about 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, logistics. Yeah.
So Detroit just made it through.
Just before I'll let you go, because, again, we don't have the best connection, but I just want people to at least have a little bit of a feel for what is there. We do have a link to the website, African Mission Healthcare. But how can people first pray for you? And second of all, how can they maybe donate to this very significant need? Can even people begin to put their head around the fact that you have more than 1 million people? And as far as I know, you're the only doctor there.
Yep. Well, I think for prayers, Kirby, certainly pray for peace in our region. This is an area that's been in civil war for most of the past 64 years. So primarily that if we get our peace, that's first. Second is for our own strength and perseverance, that we can continue to serve God here by taking care of God's children. So I think those are the 2 main things. And if people are willing and able to support us, we greatly appreciate it. We promise you that your money will be used very well.
Oh, sure.
All donations come through African Mission Healthcare, and that's through the NewList2020.com campaign. NewList2020.com.
Well, I appreciate you giving us some time. We had a little difficulty with the connection. We don't have the best audio, but I just wanted people to hear a little bit from on the ground. And let me just encourage individuals to pray for you. And again, we have information about this mission, African Mission Healthcare. And if you said, well, I couldn't hear everything he said, we have a news release there that talks about him receiving the top medical missionary award. Of course, we have some information in the news and some of the other interviews, a press kit, a variety of other resources. But most importantly, if you scroll down, you'll see his picture. And if nothing else, I just wanted from time to time to say, no matter what your circumstances are, it could be just a whole lot more difficult for many individuals. So there is a button there that says donate and support the mission of, again, the work of the African Mission Healthcare. And so I would encourage you to do so. So, Dr. Catena, I'm hoping sometime we can get you here to the United States. We get you in studio and get a chance to do a full interview with you. So thank you for joining us today here on Point of View. Let's, if we can, just real quickly, see if we can put a couple other issues on the table. And one of those that I wanted to address is back to this whole issue of the loss of liberty and the fact that around the world, we're moving into something that looks a lot like a surveillance state. So in some respects, I don't want to overplay this, but it has been striking, as I will get to in just a minute, to see how things have been implemented not only in countries that might be considered somewhat totalitarian or authoritarian, but even countries that would be found in Europe and in South America. And so we're not just talking about China, but we're also talking about South Korea, and we're talking about countries like France and Belgium. We're talking about countries like Bolivia and Peru, as well as some of the former Soviet bloc countries like Hungary. And these have all been a real concern because we're starting to see more and more of this being sort of a justification for government involvement and government opportunities to dramatically increase the, if you will, the scope of government around individuals' lives. And so just the other day, of course, I quoted from our friend Matt Walsh, who pointed out that any kind of gathering that is considered to be unhealthy, illicit, or against the particular order issued by the mayor or the governor is enough. And so you have, for example, even a parade of elementary school teachers in Kansas City closed down because even though they were in cars, that was enough for various police to break that up. Of course, the one that I think always gets people going is the examples out of California. Two that I've collected. One of this man who was out on a paddleboard in the ocean. And if you've ever been out in the ocean, you know you're pretty far away. There's not a chance that you could be getting the coronavirus nor spreading the coronavirus, but he was pulled out of the ocean by the police and hauled away in handcuffs. Just down the road a little bit in San Diego, you had individuals that were watching the sunset on the beach. And again, they were actually cited. You have, of course, the police in Pennsylvania that ticketed a woman who was going for a drive. And then you have another one in Minnesota, which I mentioned before, where this woman received 2 tickets, one for driving with a canceled license, which that seems fair. But the second one was for violating the stay-at-home order because she'd gone to a Taco Bell. And, of course, you've heard me talk about some of the products that cannot be sold. We mentioned for our Michigan listeners just a minute ago the fact that you, at least in one of these Walmarts here, had roped off the child's car seats. And yet, if you are a parent, you're supposed to have a car seat. The governor there in Michigan also had an order that prohibited visits to other residences, including visits to vacation homes, a neighbor's house, or to relatives. It says in a press conference, all public and private gatherings of any size are prohibited. And, of course, it's unclear, of course, how these would be actually be evaluated. And, again, what kind of proof should somebody in Michigan be required to show that the home in which they're staying isn't a vacation home? And so you can see that one as well. And then, of course, you had individuals, as we've mentioned before, who have been pro-life picketers outside of abortion clinics that have been arrested both in North Carolina, that'd be the Benham brothers, and in California. So North Carolina, California, and some of the rest are all examples of that. So those are just a few of many that I'm collecting and actually probably going to put in an essay that will be in the Outlook magazine. But if you think it's bad in this country, we'll wind down after the break with what is happening overseas. Some of these leaders simply seem to have lost their minds, or else the power has gone to their head. So we're going to talk about that and then wind down our conversation on this whole issue of the coronavirus. So again, lots of things to cover, and we'll be talking about tomorrow. I might just mention trail life and some other very positive ways that we, even in the midst of sheltering in place, can do some things that I think will be a real encouragement. So even though we'll be talking about some of the threats to our liberty, especially overseas, to those Christians over there, but even some of the benefits that we are benefiting from, even with this shelter in place, and how we can turn some of these situations into a positive witness. We'll come back and talk about that right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back this week, we're going to spend some time, I think, looking at this whole issue of whether or not we can begin to move away from a lockdown in a sequential way. Dr. Anthony Fauci has been kind of in the news over the last few days because of all the comments he's made, has been talking about maybe a rolling reentry as early as next month. And so that would be the way in which maybe you could identify and isolate people that might be infected. Of course, as the various testing and treatments pick up, we'll see where that goes. And of course, there's all sorts of back and forth about the Trump tweet in which he reminded them that, there was actually one individual that even created a hashtag called #FireFauci. And he points out that, if anything, he made a decision in late January to restrict travel from China, as I pointed out just a minute ago. Imagine if he'd made that even 2 weeks earlier, the reaction that would have been there. But I love his line, "Sorry, fake news, it's all on tape." And that's the case. It is on tape. I can show you some tapes where individuals were assuring us that this was not a problem. But then all of a sudden, once it became a problem, that is the case. And I would probably have more sympathy for some of these criticisms and some of these op-ed pieces coming out right now if they started out by saying, look, hindsight is 20/20. Yeah, sometimes in hindsight we can see all sorts of things. also what was happening politically at the time, in impeachment and all sorts of other activities, which maybe caused all sorts of people, not just the president, take their eye off the ball. But when it just simply acts like we had definitive evidence in early January for closing down the country, first of all, that was politically untenable, especially in a country like ours. But we should have recognized that when all of a sudden such draconian measures were taken in China, it probably meant something was of concern. And let's, if we can, just for a minute, talk about some of those, because I have given you some articles that you can read about what has happened to churches. But some of these others are kind of interesting as well. You have, for example, in China, where they have leveraged already an intrusive system, forcing people to install on their cell phones apps that assign them a code that at least gives you the perceived risk of them spreading contagion. Now, South Korea didn't go that far, but it still tracked people's cell phones and credit card usage as a way to do that. They also, of course, have used these surveillance cameras to monitor the movements of individuals. Matter of fact, if you haven't read my booklet on privacy and surveillance, those are the kinds of things we were concerned about as more and more of these surveillance cameras are being put out. You have not only in China, but also in Spain, and now even in California here in the United States, using aerial drones to detect unauthorized gatherings of people, and then to have loudspeakers on those drones violating orders. This picture here that I got in front of me, I think, is actually from Italy. You have a couple here that's actually looking out of its balcony there, and there's a drone flying by with that. Then you have many governments which have actually attached GPS ankle monitors on individuals to do so. And so this particular article says that in most cases, big brotherish tactics have been sold as temporary measures intended to battle very real danger from the pandemic. The surveillance is intended to enforce social distancing and track carriers of the new coronavirus so that we can end the health crisis. But what if the government, as they act so appropriately, doesn't want to abandon those new powers? And so this is one of the concerns there as well. And to use some other examples, this isn't just happening in just a few isolated countries. You have, for example, France and Bolivia that have postponed elections, Peru, which has given broad legislative authority to its president. Even Israel has ramped up some of its surveillance as well. And this particular article said the speed and breadth of the transformation is unsettling political scientists, government watchdogs, and rights groups. Many concede that emergency declarations and streamlining of government decision-making are necessary responses to a global health threat, but they question how readily leaders will give up their powers they've accrued once the coronavirus eventually subsides. A good example is where I was supposed to be next month is in Hungary. The prime minister there has been given just near dictatorial powers over individuals there and some of that. And then even in places like Belgium, you have the authorities requisitioning cell phone companies' location tracking data to make sure people are not straying too far from their homes. And, of course, you have places where you have police checkpoints at major streets monitoring what the phone companies might miss. So that's the world that we find ourselves in right now. And so if nothing else, it kind of brings us back to one last point that I thought I might make, because as you are going to hear this constant drumbeat this week, that the president should have acted earlier, then at least let's give credit to somebody who deserves a great deal of credit, and that would be Senator Tom Cotton. Because as I've pointed out before, here is an individual on January 22nd. That'd be the day after Anthony Fauci said there's no worry. This is when the Arkansas senator sent a letter to the Secretary of Health and Human Services warning that the Chinese communists were likely censoring key information about the disease. My commentary came out just a few days after that, I might just point out. And then during the impeachment trial, there was a classified briefing on the virus. How many senators showed up? 14. 14 out of 100. They didn't see it was that important during that time. By January 28th, of course, Senator Tom Cotton, had sent a letter to all sorts of cabinet officers calling for a ban on travel from China, which is exactly what took place. And, of course, you remember the reaction. This is an overreaction. It's xenophobic. It's racist. There's seen people now that are saying the president should have acted earlier. Right. And if nothing else, he saw what most people should have seen, and that is the kinds of situations that were unfolding there. They were taking unprecedented action. They were locking down 75 million people. They were confining people to their apartments. They were actually welding shut the doors to some of those. They were arresting people that if they left their houses. And so as a result, Senator Tom Cotton's not a doctor, not even a healthcare expert, but he could see what China was doing. And now when we're having people say, well, we should have acted earlier, where were some of those individuals when Tom Cotton was kind of the lone voice calling for any kind of action? So we have a lot more to cover. We will do so all through this week. I think you'll really enjoy the conversations. And at any point, if you find yourself saying, okay, you said a lot of things, but I want to read it for myself. It's on the website, pointofview.net. Click on the See More, and you can read those and then pass them on to others. You might want to post one or two of them on a Facebook page or a Twitter tweet and start a conversation about some of the things that are going to be happening this week. I think the president's going to be announcing, and Dr. Anthony Fauci talking about the fact that maybe we can do a rollout. And what does that look like? And again, the firestorm that I predict will take place, because that, of course, is my commentary today on the website, pointofview.net. Tomorrow we'll talk about what you can maybe do with your kids, maybe even camping out in the backyard. Trail Life has a great idea, so we'll be talking about that, and we'll get into some other issues in the news. So, again, you can follow us every single day by simply going to the website, pointofview.net. If you don't have a chance to hear it live, you can go to the website and click on the button that says watch or listen and benefit from some of those conversations as well. I want to thank Andrew for his help as an engineer, Steve for his help as a producer, and I hope that you will stay safe, stay in your home, and join us tomorrow right here on Point of View.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.